Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I want to present another layout design story. This one is for an N-scale layout. And here we have the room plotted with all the main dimensions drawn in. We can see it's approximately 19.5 feet long by 11.5 feet wide. And for those of you accustomed to HO scale dimensions, this would probably seem like a really cramped space. And yes, indeed, it would be an HO. But in N-scale, it's a lot more reasonable, and there is plenty of room to get the type of layout that the customer wanted. Now, although the room is about 19.5 feet long, most of the space at this end is not available to us. As we can see, there are two doors in this corner, one opening in and one out. And the southwest corner of the room has to be left open for laundry facilities. We can see there is a washer and dryer in this corner. And discussion with the customer revealed that he expected the upper deck to be able to continue above the washer and dryer as far as this door. That's right, we're already talking about a multi-deck layout before we even put pen to paper. Right off the bat, he wanted two scenic decks and subterranean staging. Now, the main area of the room is completely free from obstructions, which is great. There are light switches at locations A and B. Now, the one at A is not going to be an issue because, as you've already mentioned, only the upper deck can extend above the washer and dryer. We need about 52 inches clearance, and the light switch is below that level. Although the light switch at B does have to be kept in mind, particularly with regard to the lower deck. Now, the customer wanted a busy double-track main line set in the 1990s, and loosely based on the area around Seattle, with the main line running along the edge of the Puget Sound. He wanted to run both local and through mixed freights, unit grain trains, and some lengthy intermodal trains. He wanted his industries to include a cement works and a steel mill. He pointed out to me that Seattle had an electric furnace feeding a mini mill, which of course is a lot smaller and more modelable than a full-size mill with blast furnaces as East Coast modelers would be familiar with. Now, it quickly became apparent that there was only really one basic footprint that worked well in the space, and that was a folded dog bone with the two end lobes opposite each other and the main line around the east end of the room. We decided that 36 inches was enough space to keep clear in front of the washer and dryer, and with curving the benchwork corner at about a 15-inch radius where I expected it to end up, it turned out that we had 38 inches clear space between the corner of the dryer and the layout benchwork. So we're in good shape there. And also we see that the end lobes are more than 3 feet apart, so we have a few inches of tolerance there. At this stage, we're working on about a 20-inch mainline radius, which is plenty large enough to make his long intermodal cars and big 6-axle diesels look comfortable on these curves. I did eventually shave the hidden curves down a few inches, but I stayed with the 20-inch visible mainline radius throughout. So now it was time to start blocking in the major elements of the plan, and I immediately decided that the intermodal yard had to go along the back wall because that is the longest straight run available anywhere in the room. I put the local freight yard along the north wall because this is about a foot longer than the south wall, which means that the junction area and the helix ends up in the south lobe. Now, of course, a local freight yard can be curved somewhat, whereas an intermodal yard really has to have its tracks straight for the cranes to work. And part of the south lobe can also be used to include some harbour facilities. Now, on the upper deck, we come out of a helix, and of course we have to run around the room twice to get back to have the steel mill in this corner of the room above the washer and dryer. But at this end of the room we see there is a simple mainline junction because I wanted to add an alternative route for some staging loops on this level so that we could run a higher train density than would be possible if all the trains had to be terminated at this one small town. And I figured there'd be space for approximately 6 tracks around this reversing loop. Now, the other plan I drew had the local freight yard switched to the southern lobe with the helix near the door, but the layout schematic is pretty much the same. Doing it this way round, we have the option of using this area in the corner above the dryer for another harbour area. And this represents a north-south main line running through Seattle along the edge of the Puget Sound, with the operators facing east. And if you look at a map of that area, you'll see that there are in fact two harbours north and south of this area. And if we were to imagine running from the North Harbour to the south, we would traverse a mirror image of an elongated C shape. And that's basically what we have here, except we've had to twist this end to make it fit. The North and South Harbour are more or less in their correct relative locations. Now, with the reversal of the main deck, the upper deck of course has to be somewhat different. I've kept the staging loops in the same location, but in this case, instead of having the line to the steel mill wrap around the room twice and the main line take a shortcut to the staging, it is the main line to the staging loops that runs around the room twice, with the other route proceeding directly to the steel mill. And then another version I drew for the upper deck is this one, where we have the main line running directly to both the staging yard and the steel mill, only running around the room once instead of twice. Now, in his answers to the questionnaire, the customer did say that he was okay with the main line running more than once through the same scene if it was necessary, but we figured that we had enough operational interest without doing that, so that's why I presented this simplified version. And it turned out that this was the one that he liked the best. Now, going back to the lower deck again, I made some adjustments and figured that it was possible to improve the area for the North Harbour by thinning down the benchwork of the north lobe and putting in a mini peninsula on the lower deck only. That would allow North Harbour to be jutting out into the middle of the room and viewable from all sides and make a much better job of it. If we recall from the previous plan, it was somewhat cramped, and he really liked this idea. So now let's start filling in some details. Here is the next plan I drew. And as we can see, most of the track has now been filled in properly using correctly sized turnouts. By this time it was decided that we were going to go with fast track turnouts on all visible locations, but we were going to stick with the Pico Code 80 range for the staging yards and other hidden areas to save some money. And I've laid out all those areas with their longest turnouts, the 36-inch radius, which has approximately a 1 in 7 crossing angle. And conveniently, it also has a long crossing of that same angle, and I ended up using 3 of those down here. But I'll come back to that later. Now, the customer decided that he wanted this North Harbour to be an oil transfer facility, and we talked about making the South Harbour a grain pier. And also, by widening the benchwork around the back end of the layout by about 6 inches, there's some room for diagonal general merchandise piers, as indeed there was in this location on the real Seattle area. Although, as I mentioned earlier, we're not really trying to make it a close copy of Seattle, it's just loosely based on that area. I wasn't able to find any evidence of major export grain elevators in the Seattle area, so we're just taking modeler's license in making the Southern Harbour a grain pier. Satellite photographs look as though the real South Harbour is actually a container port, although, as I mentioned earlier, we needed to keep the intermodal yard at the longest straightaway, so therefore it is along the back wall of the layout. Now, one thing you may have noticed already is that each iteration of the plan includes more and more harbour area, and that trend continued as the plan developed. The more I discussed it with the client, the more it turned out that he liked his harbour areas, and we ended up with a lot of waterfront facilities on the final iteration of the plan. This version gives a good indication of the scope of the facilities that are possible. At the moment, the industrial area along the south is really just a placeholder. I've just put a few spurs in just to see what sort of alignments fit with standard turnouts. And I've also drawn in the double track main line extending around the back of the layout, although this will be entirely hidden under the cityscape. You may notice that in most places there is plenty of space behind the rearmost track for a good rendition of the city centre. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a north-south main line, so the north route would head to Everett and the south main line will be heading towards Tacoma. And in the corner of the room there will be a long grade heading down to the staging level. If we follow the path of a train arriving from staging, It can either take this crossover and appear from the south, or it can run around this reversing loop, which I'm calling the Everett loop, to allow it to arrive from the north. So this is kind of a reverted Y. It's not quite as convenient as if I could have got a conventional Y in, but on the plus side it means that this loop line is long enough to hold a train temporarily if it is necessary for it to wait for an opposing train to clear. So let's now go down to the staging deck. Note that the connection is in this southeast corner, and we see that the main line runs around two sides of the room before arriving at the lower helix. Now it may look like it's a long way to the staging yard, but this line around the edge does not add any running distance, since it's basically the top part of the helix unwrapped. And although I haven't drawn the staging yard in detail yet, the idea is that incoming trains will drop down the inner track on the helix, run around in front of the staging yard, around this reversing loop, and then will be parked facing towards home, ready for its next trip. And of course, all uphill trains will use the outer track on the helix, where the grade is slightly lower. That's a feature I always try to get in if I possibly can, which is why the helix wraps in this direction. Had we gone with one of the other plans that put the helix in the south lobe, I would have drawn it the other way around. Here is the upper deck, and as we can see, the helix is also double tracked. Even though all the main lines on this deck are single tracked, the helix is double tracked to avoid the bottleneck which would result from such a long single track section. Now schematically this is just a very long passing siding, but it can still be run as a double track main line with all uphill trains around the outside of the helix. And also we can see from this view where I have cut back the upper deck 6 inches along the sides and a foot along the back, making the middle of the room a lot more open, which is something worth considering with multi-deck layouts. So now with everything roughed in, I guess it's time to start filling in more details. Here we see the main deck of the layout with some more of the details filled in. I've done some tweaking of the track arrangements in the various harbour areas and started filling in non-railroad features such as roads and the tank farm, the North Harbour. In every location that the track disappears from view on this deck, it disappears under a road bridge rather than tunnels, although I've used tunnels on the upper deck for contrast. I've added some variety to the north end of Puget Sound, where I've got some natural water banks and a seawall area. Also suggested a lighthouse, because obviously they would have some there in a busy shipping area. The track arrangement for North Harbour has changed quite a bit. I found room for 4 oil loading tracks, so 2 double-sided racks, and I put a single track down the other side of the pier. I've labelled it for miscellaneous chemicals, and the idea is that it allows some variety because we could have it set up for bottom unloading, whereas all the oil tankers would be set up for top unloading. And I've also put a couple of extra spurs in this area to be used for sorting cars into the correct order, allowing it to be done in the area of the North Harbour instead of oversubscribing the limited capacity of the local freight yard. There's also an extra wharf added in this corner. The client asked for a scrap metal loading wharf because that is the main source of steel for the electric furnace on the upper deck. So scrap will be loaded from barges into gondolas at this point and taken to the steel mill above the laundry area. I still have not finalised the location of the industrial spurs in this area. That will be done in the next iteration. Although I have added some extra facilities in the South Harbour. Instead of being just a grain elevator, we now also have a car float. Now the client and I are both aware that car floats were not as prevalent on the Pacific coast as they were on the Atlantic coast, and it probably wouldn't have lasted into the 1990s. But this is a model railroad intended for the client's entertainment rather than as a historical document. Now, fairly important around car floats is to have a local yard of at least the same capacity as the car float, so that the cars can be sorted into the correct order to balance the float properly. And note that the grain elevator is angled slightly away from the wall, so that in the corner it is deep enough to hide the corner of the backdrop, whereas along the narrow section where every inch is critical, it doesn't take up any more space than it needs to. Ideally, I would have liked to have put a third track serving the grain elevator, because then we could originate a nice long unit train. But we'd already decided on a 12-inch benchwork at this point. Every extra inch starts to cramp the access to the dryer, and we didn't want to do that unnecessarily. Maybe he'll add a third track when he builds it, but I just showed two for the time being. I felt it was more important to get the float yard in. And of course, the car float and the grain elevator will be switched at different times of day, so the small yard in the middle can be used for sorting grain cars when it's not needed for switching the car float. Now at this point, apart from the industrial area, all the track locations are pretty much fixed. I've kept the 20-inch minimum visible mainline radius, although in most places it is 24 inches or better. I dropped down to 18 inches on the inside track of the helix and 17 inches on the Everett loop. And the branch line to South Harbour drops down to a 16-inch radius, but I was able to keep a full-length easement in every case. And that makes a lot of difference for ensuring that the trains run smoothly. The sharpest curves on the railroad are the tracks leading into the general merchandise piers at 13 inches radius, which in N scale is still plenty big enough to be able to switch reliably. Oh, one other thing you'll notice here is that I moved the backdrop forward on this deck to allow access to the light switch. At first I only moved it 4 inches, although in later plans I decided that 6 inches was better. Gives more space. And if I was building the layout for myself, I wouldn't leave the light switch where it was. I would have the fascia extended between the two decks at this point and mount the light switch on it. I've been in the construction trade long enough that I know my way around residential wiring codes, and although I would be perfectly safe to move the switches, I'd recommend anybody not familiar with wiring standards to hire an electrician before doing anything like that, because mains electricity can kill. Now, with the main deck taking shape quite nicely, I moved down to the staging level. Here we see one way of fitting a good-sized staging yard into the space. If you recall earlier, I said the trains would arrive down the inner helix, run around an avoiding line in front of the yard, around a reversing loop, and then be staged facing back towards the helix, ready for the next run. I included 14 long tracks here. I could have put about 4 more in the back behind this down ramp, but I decided not to. My reasoning is that by not going more than 2 feet in, we don't need such a wide spacing between the decks, because it is within arm's length. The owner doesn't have to be able to get his upper torso between the decks to be able to reach the rear track. I also showed some optional spare locomotive storage at this end and some optional helper locomotive storage at the far end, just in case he finds a need to add rear end helpers to his heavier trains to get them back up the helix. Now, these staging tracks are all fairly long. Some of the longer ones could conceivably hold 2 trains. They're certainly long enough for some really nice through freights. And note how the helix and the reversing loop have been kept in alignment with the curves above them. That way it can form the foundation for the upper helix, because the most difficult part of building a helix is getting the first lap right. And since the upper helix is directly above this one, this will form an accurate foundation to build it on. And it's effectively just building one helix with a gap in it. So the spacers between the top of the lower helix and the bottom of the upper helix will just be longer. And by ensuring that this loop is several inches back from the benchwork edge, it means that anyone bending down to get to the dryer has more space for their rear end. Moving on now to the upper deck. Here I have filled in the steel mill area. It took me a couple of attempts to get this right, because even a small mill fed by a single electric furnace is still a large industry, and it needs yards both for the common carrier and for the steel mill. So I have a 3-track common carrier yard and a 5-track mill yard. Now, maps that I have of full-size steel mills show that the mill yard usually has more tracks than the common carrier yard that it interchanges with, although they are not necessarily as long. By extending the yard off the end of the benchwork, we give the appearance that it continues, and also by making sure that it is not quite parallel with the main line. It helps to disassociate it visually. Now I've made sure that the head shunt on the arrival track is long enough to hold 3 6-axle locomotives, because I'm thinking that the trains serving the steel mill will probably be quite heavy. I've also shown where a few smaller industries can be placed, just to give a nice contrast with the steel mill behind it. And I have the electric furnace built into the coved corner of the backdrop. So although it is plenty big enough to give the appearance of a full-size electric furnace, only about half of it is actually modelled, because the rest is behind the backdrop curve, and the tracks can extend through, so they don't necessarily need to be cut off short. I've also put one of the rolling mills in this coved corner and shown how the track serving that can extend about 4 feet past it. So there's good capacity for a full train length worth of cars between these two tracks. I've labelled this mill as for structural steel. Now my research tells me that electric furnaces tended to be limited on the size of structural steel they produce. It would be light to medium only, so no bridge girdles or anything like that. I've labelled them for wire and rebar, which were commonly made in electric furnaces. And then this long straight area along the back will just be filled with a backdrop flap, and I've labelled it as a continuous caster, although it's basically just a generic slab-sided steel structure. And of course there has to be a power plant in there somewhere, and I've put that in the corner next to the furnace. It won't be particularly easy to interchange traffic between the two yards, but since there'll be a relatively small operating crew, it's unlikely that there's going to be 2 people trying to switch at this town at the same time, so the steel mill operator can just switch on the main line when there's no mainline freight in town. It's just one of those compromises that sometimes has to be made to fit a larger than room size prototype into a smaller space. Now here is the finished version of the main deck, with all the scenery filled in and coloured nicely. We can see that there is room for about 5 or 6 city blocks of downtown Seattle. I've shown a park in this awkward triangular corner. Of course, if he has a favourite steam locomotive, he could put it on display in this park and call it Railroad Park. And it has the advantage of not hiding the structures behind it. Now note that when we have tall structures along the backdrop, we don't need to go to the complication of curving it. So you'll notice that I've let the backdrop go straight into all the corners in the city area. The tall city structures will hide it. Not only is it easier to build that way, but it gives us more space for our structures. It doesn't cut this corner off shorter than it would otherwise need to be. I've found room for a road running all the way around the harbour, serving all the various wharfs, because road access is important. I moved the scrap wharf a little bit closer to the fascia, because that gave us room for a decent truck servicing area and weighbridge behind it. Maybe I should have mentioned earlier, I put this ship in. I know it's not the right kind of ship, but it's one that I'd already drawn. Call me lazy if you want to for not drawing a tanker, but I just wanted to see how much of a ship was possible, and when I put a ruler on this, it scaled out at about 340 feet, which is a good length for a coastal cargo ship. The rest of the wharf areas will just have to be serviced with barges, because that's the only place on the layout where there is room for a believable size ship. The client tells me that's not a problem, because this area was served largely by barge traffic anyway. Now at this end, there was plenty of length for the road to gain the 2 inches necessary to get it over the top of the track and still be down to track level at this end. At the other end, I had to take a bit of a detour, and of course the main road that comes down in front of the yard can start sloping down at this point as well, as soon as it gets over the last bridge. And although this track passes over 2 turnouts, I made sure that it was running over the middle of the turnout instead of the moving areas, because it is, after all, the switch points which are most likely to need access for maintenance. It might still be advisable to have the bridge removable anyway. I put 2 container cranes in the intermodal yard, because it just gives the impression of a bigger and busier yard, and there's plenty of area for stacking containers along the back wall. I've also now finally got the opportunity to finish detailing the south half of the room. One thing you may notice is that this area that used to have just a single spur labelled for diesel refueling now has 3 spurs, I found room for a short maintenance of waste storage track, which always has interesting equipment, snow plows and stuff like that, and also a route track, which not only is an extra industry to serve, but it's a very convenient place for parking bad ordered cars whenever you find them during an operating session. I labelled all the industries, and in the write-up that I sent to the customer, I described each one individually. Although most are still generic, there are some relevant points worth mentioning. We'll see that all of the spurs are accessed from the single track through the container yard, so once the local train has crossed over the main line, it need not foul it again until it's finished its switching. This spur serving industries A and B is the only one facing the other way, and this gives a lot of interest because there's no run round over this side of the main line, so the local switcher will have to leave the yard with cars for industries A and B on the opposite end of the locomotive. C is another industry that's not rail served, because of course in this day and age there would be many industries no longer rail served. D is a good location to put a building over the top of the track, allowing it to be visually much larger than there is really space for it. Industry E is just shown as a row of structures along the backdrop with two tracks disappearing between them. Now we're assuming that these two tracks head deeper into a much larger industry which has its own private switcher, and the common carrier railroad switcher can drop off a train length cut of cars on one of these tracks and pick up the other track full of outbound cars and return it to the main yard for switching into outbound freights. Meanwhile, it is assumed that the industry's local switcher will deliver the cars, and then the cut that we dropped off today will become the outbound cut for the next operating session. Industry F is some kind of storage facility with both rail and truck loading docks. Large 1 or 2 story facilities like this are common throughout the country. G should probably be several stories high to give a bit of height to this area, and is also served with one track heading into it. And note how I've also shown this heading through the backdrop, so it can have a lot more capacity than it would otherwise appear to. H is built into the curve of the backdrop. Although it is visually fairly deep at both ends, it is much shallower in the middle, so it actually takes up a lot less space than it appears. I suggested some kind of aggregate industry for J, such as asphalt or ready-mix concrete, something like that, because it allows an opportunity for some interesting shaped structure in an odd-shaped space. K is another storage area, probably a single-story warehouse with a long loading dock along one side, and one would assume a truck loading dock along the other, but it's cut open along the front of the fascia, allowing a great opportunity for viewing a full interior. I've done the same thing with L, but also suggested some chemical storage tank just for interest. And note how I've also added a few green belt areas just to break up the monotony of such extensive city areas. And once again, the main line disappears under a road bridge. And this unlabelled track between the main line and the harbour branch is of course the yard lead. This one is a little bit short, but at the other end we have more than enough space by using the track towards North Harbour as an extended lead. Now the elevations on this deck are quite complex. Early on we talked about having the container yard at a slightly higher elevation than the main line, just to add some interest, which is why it diverges well away from the yard. And there is room to get this about an inch higher without an excessive grade. And at the north end of the container yard, the approaches will be level, and it will be the main line that will have the grade up. And then at this bridge, it can start heading back down again. And the hidden track that runs around underneath the city will be at a couple of inches below datum, as will the Everett Loop. I'll also note that Industry B needs to be removable because that is directly above the crossovers on the approach track down to the staging yard. They are directly underneath this industry, which is the reason why I made it that size. Just lift out that one industry and you have easy maintenance of the 4 turnouts and 2 diamond crosses below it. The vast majority of the turnouts on the visible portion of the layout are of 3 sizes. We have the number 6 and number 8 straight, And the vast majority of the curb turnouts are, I think, the 3020s. So the plan is that he will probably buy those 3 jigs and build those himself, and then order all the odd sizes from Bruce Giroux, the gentleman that I refer all my N-scale turnout customers to. Okay, let's now go to the upper deck. Here is the upper deck finished. We can see that I've filled in the industries in this small town. Note the addition of the intermediate crossover. Not only does it mean that we don't have to run the full length of the passing track to make a run-round maneuver, but we don't have to walk around the mini peninsula to get to the switch. We can instead use the east switch and the crossover. The industries I've suggested for this town are the cement works that he asked for and a grain elevator. I've also shown a track leading off the benchwork edge. I'm assuming that it will be a weed-covered abandoned track leading to an industry that is no longer rail served, although the first few car lengths have now been pressed into service as a team track, so it's still an operational feature. The grades on this level are a lot simpler. The whole north half of the room will be level, and then the grades would divide at this junction, with the one track dropping down to staging and the front track climbing steadily to rise over the top of it. And because trains look so cool running alongside water, I've added a river on this level where the steel mill branch just follows the riverbank. Now all the main line on this deck represents a line heading inland towards the east, and when I looked on a map of the area I found the town of Monroe, so at least for now we are calling this the Monroe subdivision. Anyway, I am fairly pleased with the way this layout turned out, and the customer is too. I think that's about all I have to say about it, so I'm just going to sign off here. Hope you've enjoyed this presentation, hope you found it useful, and hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.